The Brexit referendum, held on June 23, 2016, was a defining moment in modern British history. It marked the culmination of decades of debate over the United Kingdom's membership in the European Union (EU), and set the stage for one of the most consequential and contentious political decisions in recent history. The vote, where 52% of the voters chose to leave the EU, compared to 48% who opted to remain, triggered a series of events that reshaped the UK's domestic and international landscape, with implications still being felt today. Historical context and origins of Brexit. The UK's relationship with the European Union has always been complicated. The UK joined the European Economic Community, EEC, the predecessor to the EU, in 1973 under Prime Minister Edward Heath. While membership was initially seen as a way to boost the economy and strengthen trade ties, skepticism toward the European project grew over the years. Many Britons felt that the EU's increasing centralisation and political integration, such as the establishment of the European Parliament and the introduction of the euro currency, which the UK opted not to adopt, eroded national sovereignty. Euroscepticism, or distrust of the EU, gained traction in the UK throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Critics argued that the EU imposed excessive regulations, hindered British businesses, and restricted the country's ability to make independent decisions. Immigration also became a central concern, as the EU's principle of free movement allowed citizens of member states to live and work in any EU country. For many, particularly after the EU's eastward expansion in the 2000s, this led to fears of overpopulation, job competition, and strain on public services. By the early 2010s, these grievances had reached a boiling point. The UK Independence Party, UKIP, led by Nigel Farage, capitalised on these concerns, gaining widespread support with its call to leave the EU. Simultaneously, divisions within the Conservative Party over Europe became increasingly difficult to ignore. Facing pressure from Eurosceptic members of his own party and the rise of UKIP, Prime Minister David Cameron promised in 2013 to hold a referendum on EU membership if the Conservatives won the next general election. The referendum campaign following the Conservative Party's victory in the 2015 general election, Cameron fulfilled his pledge and announced the EU referendum for June 23, 2016. The referendum presented a simple yet profound question: should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? The campaign leading up to the vote was deeply polarized. The Leave campaign was spearheaded by groups like Vote Leave, which was supported by prominent politicians such as Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and Nigel Farage. Their slogan, "Take Back Control," encapsulated their message. They argued that leaving the EU would allow the UK to reclaim its sovereignty, regain control of its borders, and reduce immigration. Economic independence was another key argument, with Leave advocates claiming that the UK could negotiate its own trade deals and save money by no longer contributing to the EU budget. One of the most controversial claims was that leaving the EU would free up £350 million per week to be spent on the National Health Service, NHS, a figure that was widely criticised for being misleading. The Remain campaign, led by figures including David Cameron, George Osborne, and other prominent political and business leaders, focused on the potential economic risks of Brexit. They warned that leaving the EU could lead to job losses, trade disruptions, and a recession. The EU was portrayed as a stabilizing force that allowed the UK to benefit from access to a single market and strengthened its geopolitical position. Cameron and others argued that remaining in the EU would ensure economic prosperity, security, and continued influence on the global stage. The campaign was marked by heated debates, misinformation, and emotional appeals. Immigration became a particularly contentious issue, with Leave campaigners highlighting fears of uncontrolled immigration, while Remain advocates emphasized the economic and cultural contributions of EU migrants. The results and immediate aftermath. When the results were announced, the UK had voted to leave the EU by 51.9% to 48.1%. Over 17.4 million people voted to leave, while 16.1 million voted to remain. The referendum revealed stark divisions within the UK. Geographical divide: England and Wales voted predominantly to leave, while Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. Demographic divide: younger voters overwhelmingly supported remain, while older voters leaned heavily toward leave. Educational and urban-rural divide: cities and individuals with higher levels of education tended to support remain, while rural areas and those with fewer educational qualifications leaned toward leave. The outcome shocked many and had immediate political and economic consequences. David Cameron, who had campaigned for remain, announced his resignation the day after the referendum, stating that he could not be the one to lead the UK through Brexit. The pound sterling plummeted to its lowest level in decades, and uncertainty gripped the financial markets. The Brexit process: years of negotiations and turmoil. Theresa May succeeded Cameron as Prime Minister in July 2016. She inherited the monumental task of negotiating the UK's withdrawal from the EU, a process governed by Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. This article allowed a member state to formally notify the EU of its intention to leave, triggering a 2-year negotiation period to agree on exit terms. Key challenges of Brexit negotiations: trade and economy. Determining the UK's future relationship with the EU, particularly access to the single market and customs union, became a major sticking point. Citizens' rights: ensuring the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and British citizens living in EU countries was a priority for both sides. The Irish border: the most contentious issue was how to manage the border between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, an EU member. The EU insisted on avoiding a hard border to protect the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. This led to proposals like the backstop, which proved highly controversial in the UK. May's Brexit deal faced fierce opposition in Parliament, with critics from both the Leave and Remain camps rejecting it. After repeated defeats in Parliament, she resigned in 2019, having failed to deliver Brexit. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019, campaigning on a promise to get Brexit done. He renegotiated the withdrawal agreement, securing changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and called a general election in December 2019. The Conservatives won a landslide victory, giving Johnson the mandate to push Brexit through. The UK officially left the EU on January 31, 2020, entering a transition period that ended on December 31, 2020, during which the future trade relationship was finalized. The impact of Brexit: the consequences of Brexit have been far-reaching and remain a topic of intense debate. Supporters' perspective: sovereignty restored. Brexit supporters argue that the UK has regained control over its laws, borders, and trade policy. Independent trade deals: the UK has negotiated trade agreements with countries like Australia, Japan, and others. Immigration control: Brexit ended free movement, allowing the UK to set its own immigration policies. Critics' perspective: Economic costs. Critics point to reduced trade with the EU, labour shortages in key industries, and slower economic growth as evidence that Brexit has harmed the economy. Northern Ireland tensions. The Northern Ireland Protocol has sparked political unrest, as unionists oppose the creation of a regulatory border in the Irish Sea. Global influence. Some argue that Brexit has weakened the UK's global standing and influence. Brexit's legacy. Brexit was more than a political event. It was a reflection of deep societal divisions over identity, globalization, and the balance between independence and cooperation. It remains one of the most contentious topics in UK politics, with opinions on its success or failure deeply divided. Whether Brexit ultimately strengthens or weakens the UK, it will undoubtedly remain a defining moment in the nation's history for generations to come.